A dengue emergency in Singapore as cases continue to swell in the worst flare-up since 2020.
A global pharmaceutical company is presenting a dengue vaccine candidate to experts meeting here in Singapore. Takeda will also share results of its study on the efficacy of a dengue vaccine. Now, more than 200 experts are at the Asia Dengue Summit to discuss the latest science on battling the disease. Joining us now is the organising chairman of the summit, Professor Ooi Eng Eong. He is also professor in the programme in emerging infectious diseases at the Duke NUS Medical School. Good evening, Professor Ooi. Singaporeans, we're familiar with this routine of taking vaccines to prevent diseases like COVID. But dengue is another issue. The burden of dengue is very far-reaching globally. Over half the world's population is at risk of it every single year. As we are here in Singapore, how close are we now to having an effective dengue vaccine?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I think the dengue is very different from, say, the example of COVID that you've just brought up, that, we're dealing with 4 different viruses. It's not 4 different variants, but they're actually 4 very different viruses. And to get vaccines against each and every one of these 4 is obviously very challenging. So I think the important thing to think about or remember about dengue is we should not be expecting a magic bullet or a silver bullet, right? What we need is a number of different solutions that each on its own can work, but when put together collectively, like for example, dengue with Wolbachia, will get us the results that we need. And I think that's why we're holding this summit right now, because I think the number of new tools that are now available to the world is at a point where we actually can make a big difference in controlling dengue.
So if a vaccine candidate trial, as an example, were to work, it might be for a specific serotype. How would a dengue vaccine work? I mean, would it be a once-off or would it be, a case of having to take a jab every year or even potentially with a booster?
I think the data looks like we probably don't need every year. It's probably likely that we will need boosters. I don't think the immunity is going to last us a lifetime, but it's probably going to be somewhere like 4 or 5 years down the road after having taken the primary series. So it's 2 jabs in the first instance. Then perhaps 4 or 5 years after that before we need boosters. The data is encouraging. It's not perfect, but it's encouraging, and I think this could be a vaccine that we could use. The other vaccine that we already have licensed, but only for use in those who have had dengue vaccine, I think that too can also be used. And I think the important thing now is for us to think about how to integrate all these solutions that we have, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, even if we were to have a working vaccine, it's one of the tools. It would be one specific tool, perhaps preventing hospital cases or symptomatic cases. But what about its efficacy? Let's say that just like with COVID, we have 96% vaccination rate. Is it a case of the more people who are vaccinated, the better it is? It might even eradicate dengue if the take-up rate were high?
I think certainly with the vaccination, we know that from the clinical trials that it works very well for some serotypes, and it works especially well for those who have had dengue before. And I think that it's one of the peculiarities of our immune system, right? The more we see something, the better it learns. And it's the same way as how we learn in school, that the more we rehearse or revise, the better our knowledge would be. And same works for the immune system. But obviously, repeated jabs is definitely not the solution. We also have other tools to suppress the mosquito population. So if we can do that and then elevate the level of herd immunity in our population, I think the combination will work very well, and we will not get these repeated outbreaks that what we're getting right now.
Is it too early, Professor Ooi, to talk about the safety of using such a vaccine that might give us 4 or 4.5 years of protection?
I think the monitoring has been a lot longer. For instance, with COVID, obviously with the emergency and all that, with a 3-month clinical trial data that went all the way through, and we got our COVID vaccine safely. With dengue, they've been as careful as having monitored after they finished the trial, they monitored for another 4 years, so that they have altogether nearly 5 years worth of data to show that this is a safe vaccine that we can use. Obviously, the journey doesn't stop there. It doesn't mean that the finish line is really relatively unclear for dengue. But what happens is that the vaccine can now be licensed for use, but with the additional precaution of post-vaccination monitoring, because like I said, it's not a one-size-fit-all. You're not going to have one single solution that completely eliminates dengue. You're going to have work everything together, and I think the time is there that in some ways all the eggs have been lined up, right? It's just for us to now implement some of these tools and then bring in the new ones as they come online.
It's a multi-year effort to push back dengue. You mentioned the Wolbachia trial. Other countries are also doing that trial as well. Can you update us on Singapore's current methods of battling dengue? And is all of that going to be shared with experts at this dengue summit?
Absolutely. I think on Wednesday, we're going to hear a lot about Singapore's Wolbachia program and how they're going to integrate it into what they've been doing in the past. I think it'll be very exciting. The way Singapore is using Wolbachia is in some ways unique to Singapore because we have the means and the resource to do it. Now, certainly other places are trying alternative ways of using Wolbachia. In Singapore, we use this Wolbachia to suppress the mosquito population. In other places, they're using it to make the mosquitoes more resistant to infection and therefore less able to transmit dengue virus. So they're not suppressing the mosquito population, but rather they're making them more resistant. And that's another way that you can use Wolbachia. And I think at the end of the day, what works in Singapore will work in Singapore, but elsewhere, we may have to think of ways that are more suitable for their local situation, so that whatever that needs to work in that local environment and local factors and all that will work. So again, idea is not to say here's one solution and we're all going to adopt the same thing, but rather let's understand what's going on the ground, and let's given that now we have all these new ways of doing things, vaccines, Wolbachia, and everything else, how do we integrate them into a way that makes sense and will produce results wherever we are?
Yeah, there has to be a tailored approach, a unique tailored approach. While we have you here, Professor Ooi, let's turn our attention to COVID, because Singapore's health ministry says that the country's current vaccination rate against coronavirus, it continues to be high. Some 96% of Singapore's eligible population are fully vaccinated now. Of them, 92% have already gotten their first boosters. At the same time, the health minister said we anticipate this fifth wave of COVID-19. It might come as early as next month. The country has been offering second boosters to selected age groups. Around half of eligible seniors aged 80 and above, they have taken it up or booked appointments to get those jabs. And then on Friday, the ministry recommended that people aged 50 to 59 get their second booster shot. Now, those in that age group can walk into any vaccination centre to get those jabs. Professor Ooi, why is this group, the 50 to 59-year-old group, especially at risk of severe COVID?
I think the answer to that is relative, right? Obviously, the group that's at greatest risk are the elderly, the 80 and above, and those with immunosuppressive conditions or on treatment that cause their immune system to be suppressed. I think they're the ones that are most vulnerable to severe COVID. And then as you come down from the extreme, the higher end of the age and down towards, say, 60, 70, obviously the risk is not as low as, say, someone in the 20s, but would be lower than someone in the 80s. And I think, because the second booster shot has been rolled out in that population, it is reasonable, I guess, time to now think of, say, the 50 to 59 and eventually de-escalate that way. I think certainly if those who have chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, lung diseases, and all that, it's wise to be protected against getting even mild illness. But for majority of those with who are otherwise healthy, obviously, if they choose to wait, I don't think is harmful, because the COVID vaccines, as we know it today, given all the data that we have, if you have had 3 doses, the memory is very good. Now, the memory immune response needs time to recall. It's just like sometimes we have not done a math problem for a while. We might have to scratch our head before we figure out how to do it. But eventually we would, right? And so that's how the memory immune system works. It may not be fast enough to prevent you from falling sick, but it will prevent you from getting very sick. And sometimes maybe that's good enough, right? Because if we don't get high number of cases of severe COVID, it's not going to overwhelm our healthcare system, and it's not going to repeat what happened in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, that is the key, the prevention of severe illness. Professor Ooi, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Professor Ooi Eng Eong, the organising chairman of the Asia Dengue Summit that's taking place here in Singapore. He's also professor in the programme in emerging infectious diseases at Duke NUS Medical School.